Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal. We have a very special guest with us today, Bettina Warburg. Bettina is a blockchain expert, evangelist, and partner at Warburg Serres. You might have heard of her TED Talk in 2016 on how the blockchain will radically transform the economy, as this talk has become the go-to source for understanding the potential of blockchain. We are very excited to have her here with us today, and we have lots to discuss. Good morning, Bettina. How are you doing?
I'm great, Brian. It's great to be on the show.
Thank you so much for joining us. Yesterday was a big day for blockchain and crypto with the direct listing of Coinbase. Any initial thoughts on that?
I mean, it was a huge validator. I mean, as we look at this space, often insiders and certainly the way we think about the long-term future, we usually call it Web3.
Mm-hmm.
And when we, have experiences like that kind of listing, it just creates massive amounts of validation. You're looking at a company that is valued similarly, pretty close to how Facebook launched with their IPO. So it's a really important kind of moment. Not to say that it's, the right investment necessarily, but it's such a watershed moment for this market as it starts to mature.
Yeah, I mean, I heard a lot of people talking about the value of it as an exchange, but I think the real value is what they're able to do 5 and 10 years down the road. Like all the capabilities within blockchain and what they're going to actually do with cryptos. I mean, do you have any insight or just initial thoughts on where they might end up going in 5 or 10 years?
I mean, there's so much greenfield in this space still and lots of opportunities, both from an exchange point of view and a data point of view. You could totally imagine that, they'd be actually a great source for, data feeds on different markets, on different products that are entering the market. So we definitely have our eye on sort of where things are happening on data in this space over the long term. But we're also going to see, competitive options, things like, decentralized exchanges are already happening and being used really heavily. You have projects like Uniswap or SushiSwap, which are really the decentralized version of a Coinbase. So you're going to see different kinds of competition already emerge, just as people get more familiar with what these types of crypto assets are and how you can actually exchange them or use decentralized finance strategies going forward.
Absolutely. Well, hey, Bettina, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I think most of our guests probably know you already, but it'd be great to kind of get a little bit of a background and also how you ended up becoming so well known for blockchain technology and Web3.
I mean, that's very kind of you to say. I really see myself as a constant learner in this space. It's what attracted me to it in the very beginning. I was a researcher based in Silicon Valley, looking at different governance technologies and how they were going to really reshape a lot of our trusted relationships or how we did business over the next decade. And so I kind of found myself in this space really early on, mostly because I was so fascinated by the people, the characters, the entrepreneurs who were really visionary and kind of just big thinkers, taking on traditional institutions that most people thought, are never going to change. And so I still see myself as a learner. I've become an educator in this space. I try to share what I learn pretty regularly, both through my work and now through a lot of my investment work, but also, I've been teaching at the University of Texas at Austin for the last year and a half, helping students really start to experience this world, think about the future and sort of the 10-year future on this topic in particular. So it's been it's always a learning journey. It's what makes me really excited about Web3 is that we are still at the beginning. And even though I've been in this space since about 2013, it still feels like there's so much that's coming about now, that we're just seeing that sort of tipping point into this industry really, and into the transformation of our sort of existing platform economy over to what we think of as Web3 as sort of this next level of our internet tech stack. So it's a really exciting time, and I think you can definitely peg me as both educator and constant learner in this space.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those spaces. I mean, Demetrius and I are also researchers, and it's like we spend the majority of our day learning what we don't know, right? It's like you think you know something, and then you start digging and go deeper and deeper and deeper. But this whole segment reminds me a lot of the web in basically the late 90s, mid 90s. I'm a little bit, I believe, older than you. And I remember when we were doing BBS systems, and then the BBS systems led into the web. And then from the web, it kind of led into like, the IPO of all these .coms and things like that. And it's like, we thought we knew what was going on, but it transformed into something we didn't even imagine. And so do you have like any kind of crazy, interesting ideas on where you think this stuff could go for the general public, for example, in the next 5 or 10 years, where they're going to look back and go, wow, that really was just the beginning?
I mean, I think your example of sort of the transformation from the late 90s is a really good analogy. We often say it's the sort of Mark Twain quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
Yeah.
And looking at, sort of Web 1, if you think about that as kind of static, personal web pages, you couldn't really do very much interactive. It was very sort of publishing oriented. Then you got Web 2 and sort of the rise of a lot of like middleware companies, that were allowing us to build on top of TCP/IP and this whole sort of, interconnected communications infrastructure. You got, Oracle and content delivery networks and all of these things that made it faster, cheaper, and easier to build eventually applications. So if we sort of think of that tech stack evolution of like, oh, we had core infrastructure, and then we got this wave of kind of middleware and kind of enterprise types of companies, that made it easier to actually build commerce and other things on the web. We can sort of think of some of that as Web 2 leading into, really where we're at today with applications and sort of the platform economy of Facebook and Uber and all of the things and use on your phone. It's sort of a similar trajectory for Web 3. You can actually look at what's happening today as kind of like the early protocol wars. When TCP/IP became the dominant network, now it drives 95% of internet traffic. Nobody talks about TCP/IP. We don't really, we talk about the user experiences using YouTube or using Facebook or whatever else. But there was actually a protocol war at that time. It wasn't guaranteed that TCP/IP would be the dominant sort of direction of our internet architecture. Mm-hmm. There was like proprietary systems, IBM had some proprietary network. There was a project OSI that was all about bridging. There were all these different things happening. And we're actually in that same moment today. So if we think about kind of the 10-year future for Web 3, you can think about sort of layer 1 projects as these core infrastructure projects that are battling it out to be, the internet computer of the next decade and drive 90% of the traffic and of applications and everything else that's built on top of them. And that's where sort of blockchain sits, is just at this core infrastructure layer where you're saying, we have networks like the Definity network, Ethereum 2, which is underway, being updated right now. You have Near, you have Polkadot, you have all of these different networks that are sort of battling it out at the core infrastructure layer in this kind of protocol war. And then depending on which ones of those really drive middleware and adoption in developer communities, you'll eventually see more tooling and eventually a lot more applications built on top. So that's sort of like, that's the nuts and bolts of the next 10 years is we're going to have these 3 waves of innovation. We're already seeing lots of middleware projects come through per network. So middleware projects for Definity, middleware projects for Near or for the Flow network. All of them are really, kind of catering to entrepreneurs who want to build the next thing. And we're even seeing applications. And I think that's where, when you say like, what's going to be the change for the general public is that app layer, because that's where even today, how we know and understand the internet. We don't talk about TCP/IP. We don't talk about content delivery networks. We talk about, YouTube or TikTok or whatever Uber or whatever you're using in any kind of day-to-day capacity. So that's kind of the game changer, I think, is going to be, the really cool metaverse, wild experiences that live at the application layer. We're only like at the very, very beginning of seeing some of that. And we are seeing some of it, maybe you've seen NBA Top Shot, which is a really cool project for digital basketball trading cards that are, unique. They're being dropped in these packs and traded and sold for really high amounts of money, where you're saying like, this kind of project is earning $100 million in 30 days off of dropping these packs. And that's just one app on one network, right?
Yeah.
So it's really, it's I think just pointing the way to the kinds of new experiences that are going to be Web3 native, where the average person doesn't have to know anything about crypto or anything about, the underlying architecture. They're just going to have a really cool new experience.
When I talk to people who are not in this space, or maybe not even heavily in technology, they use words like blockchain now and crypto, and they're trying to understand it. Back in the 90s, I don't think everyone was trying to understand TCP/IP unless you were like working in the space, Everyone was just excited about, well, what is the web? Like, what can I find on there? And it almost feels like the NBA Top Shop stuff and everything feels very much like a stress test on the system. And people are like really interested in it, and they're buying into these digital assets and stuff and having a great time and enjoying it. But like when I stand back and I look at it, I go like, all these different examples are stress tests on the system, right? And for me, I like that, because I'm like, okay, now we're going to see where all this stuff kind of comes together and how it's going to unfold. And it feels very similar to the late 90s. It really does. I mean, it's like it's bringing me back to my old days of, I used to work at a company called Turbo Linux, and it's like it brings me back to the old days of like trying to build a front layer on a Linux application, right? Like we're just getting into it. I have to say though, you did a YouTube video. I forgot who you did it with. Sorry, but you start off by like talking to a little kid, and then all the way to an adult trying to understand blockchain.
Yeah. We did a video series with Wired on just sort of like 5 levels of understanding blockchain.
Absolutely loved it. It was fantastic. And I think that was, I think I spread that video to everybody, by the way, before we even met you, because it's a perfect example of how we have to scale the way that we talk about this to different people right now. And then eventually everyone will just kind of understand it. And then the stuff that you're talking about kind of falls into the background, right? The average user doesn't need to understand all this stuff. What they really want is that great front end experience, right?
Absolutely. I think that's spot on. I mean, it's, I think in my teaching capacity, I do very much care that my students learn, where the beginning of this started, why it's interesting, what those fundamental building blocks are. Because I do think, there's the one part of learning that history that helps is you can start to really understand what are some of the unique affordances of this tech that make it different from Web 2 and the architecture we have today. Like if you want to envision new products and new services and those really kind of revolutionary experiences that people are going to have, 10 years out, 5-10 years out from the application layer space, like some of it is you have to unlearn the old building blocks and mechanics of software development that is really tied to Web 2.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean, so you're totally right. You don't need to learn like how to code at, the sort of smart contract level necessarily, or like what, how a blockchain is built out. You don't necessarily need to know node infrastructure and all of that. But you do potentially really need to have a literacy around, what are the mechanics of this particular space that offer really new, unique experiences. And how can you play with those mechanics to drive those experiences forward? And I think that's actually a really exciting spot to be in today.
Yeah.
It's certainly what we try to get our students to look at from like a blockchain literacy perspective is, start to imagine, what is an internet and a digital life look like that isn't fundamentally based on the business model of advertising?
Yeah, and that's really exciting because I think we're all ready to move on from the
Yeah, I
pure
mean,
advertising model.
who isn't sick of being the free product and, having all their data scraped and then, being sort of force fed a bunch of ads in their user experience that really muck it up. And also you don't actually feel they're very effective. Like how many people have ever clicked on an ad intentionally, and then intentionally bought it because of that? Like usually you're being advertised something you've already hunted for, which means you're already either purchasing it or going to purchase it. So the ad doesn't actually drive your purchasing power any differently. So you start, the sort of advertising space in the digital world has been kind of a sham for a long time, that it doesn't really work in the same way. And they're sort of obsessed with measuring impressions. But what people forget is it means we've actually built a lot of our user experiences to facilitate measuring whether advertising works or not, and whether and monetizing that interaction. Like that is the incentive structure of almost all of our digital experiences. And it's a problem. It's not necessarily the best experience we could have. And so I think some of it now, when we talk about the future of Web3, is also acknowledging that you can do microtransactions on the back end. It doesn't even have to be something the user really experiences, but you can stack applications and and code in a way that you're creating incentives that really are about a user's engagement or about promoting different kinds of activities, about them being more like almost a co-op structure in some cases, where they're really owners of value in a network they use. So there's all of these sort of really different monetization tools when you're talking about tokenization and digital assets as driving forces in our new user experiences. I think that's the part I really hope people unlearn. It's like, don't just try to paste Web 2 experiences into Web 3. Go look at what's different about the toolbox of Web 3 software development and invent really new experiences that are built based on the new affordances of that tech.
Well, that brings up a great point for me, Bettina. I'm really interested in Web3. Can you give us kind of an overview of what is Web3? What are kind of the elements that compose it?
Yeah, I mean, at the fundamental sort of high level definition, I usually talk about Web3 as essentially it's the sort of vision of a programmable web. You're talking about internet computers that you can build applications on top of that will run as written and that anybody can use. So you're talking about using a big global shared virtual machine, which is really wild. And it means you can develop software differently because you can also develop middleware that actually lives on this computer. And now when you're writing applications, you're just tapping that middleware. Sometimes in the middleware space, we talk about them as persistent APIs. So instead of one of the major problems with Web 2 and the sort of platform economy we all know and use today is it actually has a lot of platform risk, right? It's not very, it's very risky to build on top of Facebook or on top of, LinkedIn or on top of, you name it, any network you want to name or platform you want to name, because you're sort of tied to, you're creating a dependency on that network. And in many cases, they'll turn you off, right? They'll decide they change their terms of service, they deplatform you, they think you're making too much money, they decide they want to, cut of that revenue. You can look at famous examples like the Zynga Facebook relationship as they were both going to IPO. right? Where it was like, oh, this is clearly, one of the biggest revenue generators on Facebook. And Facebook said, we want a cut of that revenue. And as Zynga IPO'd, they lost, billions of dollars of value basically, and, in a very short time. It's just, we're seeing examples of that again and again. And even in S1 filings for companies like Lyft, you'll see platform risk as something that's, an actual risk factor because they're so heavily dependent on AWS as their cloud services provider. So if AWS goes down, Lyft goes down. So you're starting to see these kind of cracks in the system that are largely because we have a lot of dependencies on, specific big tech companies. And so I think, part of what we're going to see with what's different when you build on Web3 is that you're actually able to have persistent APIs. So if the platform you're built on goes out of business, or the middleware, supposedly goes out of business, or wants to change their terms of service, you're not gutting your whole product because, they made a swap under you. Those are actually things that you can rely on and build on top of. So it sort of begs the question of just if you could build on top of Facebook or on top of LinkedIn or on top of, a gaming app or anything else, and actually keep your value, port your value to another project or another experience, what are you going to see as the new companies if that's not such a risky behavior?
That's very interesting. I'm wondering also if there's any thought currently about every now and then some deplatforming is appropriate. You see maybe a neo-Nazi website that gets taken down. Is there any thought within the community about how that would be handled in a kind of a Web3 environment?
It's a really good question. And I mean, even the whole Parler conversation in the US political discussions, of the last year were, for people who are in Web3, were really interesting because you're sort of saying, well, how would that work if Parler had been built on Ethereum? Would you be able to just shut them down? And the reality is, in some ways, no. You will have things that live on, and it is going to be a fundamental new question for people to sort of figure out the ethics of and the correct kind of response for. But you also have new mechanisms that are tied to that sort of permanence, which is you can identify things in this world. Part of the problem with the Web 2 disinformation structure is that we built commerce and we built all this stuff on Web 2. But it's sort of band-aids, right? There's no fundamental identification protocol to our current web, right? We have cookies, we have IP addresses, but identity wasn't built into the architecture. And so that has been a major problem. It's like the old New Yorker cartoon, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog or whatever, where it's like, you've got a lot of bad behavior because you can be you can represent yourself in many, many ways, and it's sort of, not really tied to a true identity. I think what we will see with Web3 is that it doesn't mean you're outing yourself as a specific individual, but there will be known identities and referenceable identities in this space that allow for, prosecution of bad behavior.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to kind of change the model there a little bit of, instead of, just worrying so much about, bad speech online or bad actors online, you'll actually see, the ability to potentially identify those people in a way that even if you don't know exactly who they are, you can potentially block their activity. So it creates really, I think that's one of those parameters that's different. It's sort of we can actually do unique value online and transact it, and we can do identity differently. Those are sort of two of the major building blocks that change Web3 over from Web 2.
Yeah, I agree that it's going to be something that will get figured out, but the solution will probably looks different than what we know now. So it sounds like from your description that blockchain is kind of an element of Web3, but it's not all of Web3. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, I think, for us, it's really, Web3 helps paint a picture of everything from the core infrastructure up to the app layer
Mm-hmm.
and those new experiences. And they will be built on, at the root, we are still talking about blockchains, but it's kind of one of those, like, if in 10 years we're talking about blockchain, then we have the same problem of if we today we're talking about TCP/IP. It's sort of like that shouldn't really be the thing we talk about anymore. We've done something wrong if we're
Yeah.
still having these grand conversations about blockchain. So yeah, for us, it's sort of helping people frame that bigger picture of this is a fundamental. The new blockchains, the third generation blockchains, is really where we are today. It's already been 10 years, over 10 years, since the Bitcoin network launched. What they are today are, essentially internet computers. And when we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about internet computers, okay, that's the base layer. Now what's going to get built on top? So everything from the base layer to the top, that's really where we're headed for Web3. And I think the major question people wonder about is sort of what's the tipping point from Web 2 to Web 3? And that's still really an unknown. I think it's going to come more from the new experiences we see that are Web 3 native, things like NBA Top Shot or some of the decentralized finance projects that are really engaging a lot of people's attention today. I think those will be more likely the tipping point rather than big tech converts over to
Yeah.
Web 3.
So when we think about kind of when we get to the app layer eventually, how do you think like a Web3 infrastructure will kind of modify the experience of the end consumer?
I really feel like one of the fundamental changes is this change around advertising. I think people
Mm.
whoppingly underestimate how much our own like product experience expectation is shaped by advertising. And once you remove that set of blinders and you say you can build experiences that are fundamentally not relevant to data scraping or advertising, I mean, my hope is that sort of unleashes a new generation of entrepreneurs
Mm.
who really see totally new kinds of products as possible, and much more creative kinds of experiences. And I can't say I'm not the one who's going to go build that. I wish I
Yeah.
was. But I hope, that people, certainly who are listening to your show and care about the user are going to think that way and start sort of imagining a very alternate set of building blocks for the kind of businesses they want to create.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We've been talking, Brian and I, amongst ourselves about kind of a need for innovation in business models themselves, because it feels like there's been, a handful that people just reuse over and over again. And it sounds like Web3 could enable like a different generation of business models.
Yeah, I mean, we're even seeing, there was obviously a lot of attention around the Beeple art that was sold by Christie's for $69 million, which is an NFT. It's digital art sold
Mm-hmm.
for $69 million. And it got a lot of attention and, sparked a lot of curiosity and skepticism and all sorts of things. But fundamentally, if you're saying creators and, creative types and artists can own what they create, can create royalty structures against their body of work, and create long-standing income streams based on that. Every time their product is resold, they can actually earn a portion of that value. Those are really flipping the model of patronage upside down and saying, whether you're an influencer, whether you're an artist or something else, you can actually participate in the economy and the value you're driving, over your lifespan. I think that's
Absolutely.
even that kind of stuff says, the people who are really creative can actually also be high earners.
We've been working in streaming media for quite some time, just as part of our day job. And one thing that has existed for quite some time, it seems to have some of the characteristics of kind of a Web3 infrastructure was BitTorrent, and it's been around for quite some time. It's decentralized peer-to-peer file sharing. It's kind of like blockchain without the encryption and security. Is that like considered like very early version of Web3? And if so, kind of like what can we learn from how that's been used?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, we have seen some examples of, peer-to-peer or different kinds of networks and projects that either look at the security angle or try to envision a different infrastructure than a more centralized one. I think we're a little bit into new territory now. A lot of what is being built for Web3 does take, the encryption part is a really big part of it. When you look at the companies and projects that are layer one, that, are these sort of internet computers, they've gutted the cryptography departments of major companies. These are projects that, in my opinion, are kind of, you can compare them to sort of what's happening with quantum computing. There's only so many that are going to have the technical chops and recruit the talent. And there's only so much talent in the world capable of doing distributed systems architecture and cryptography and all of these things that we're really now at. I think people underestimate how much, the fledgling blockchain community and crypto entrepreneurs have actually been changing the field of cryptography and changing the field of distributed systems architecture. Like a lot of the influence, they used to think it was going to go the other way around. And now it's like, no, these projects, they're not coming out of academia. They're coming out of teams that started building in this space many years ago and are now influencing, the academic fields that they started in. So it's a really cool sort of flipping of the model. And I think, what we'll start to see is sophistication of things like zero knowledge proofs and all of these topics where you can fundamentally query data without ever seeing the data. And get valid answers and know that those answers are valid. So these are things that I think are like, they're, pretty far beyond the early projects we had of like Napster and, other kinds of peer-to-peer or sort of decentralized projects.
Yeah, I remember early on, we were actually kind of proposing, hey, this is an essentially free form of file distribution. And we were actually saying to some of our partners, you can take some of your IP that's not currently monetized and just distribute it as a way of promoting and maybe embedding some other links back to your software. But then it just kind of got really taken over by pirates, and it was a shame because it's a very interesting technology. So it's kind of interesting now to see how the rest of the community is kind of revisiting, I guess, a concept in a very general sense.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think, you're spot on. And, it was a really exciting and important project, and it still will be. It's just, I think, we're seeing this go in a direction that's maybe bigger than what most people envisioned early on.
Yeah. So Bettina, I have a question. So I sometimes see this as a opportunity, and sometimes I see it as a potential threat. Do you see some industries looking at Web 3.0 and blockchain as kind of a threat? I've been hearing a lot about like, well, in the future, we might not need bankers, or we won't need notary anymore. Like all these different industries that are kind of built on these traditional models, some of those might disappear. Like, do you feel like this new technology, it could be a threat to those industries?
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, innovation is also a bit of creative destruction. You're not going to, we used to have people who were alarm clocks and would go knock on windows, and then we got the alarm clock. It's like you're going to displace different jobs and different kinds of practices and services in industries, especially because this particular tech is quite good at, driving efficiency and removing reliance on middlemen, especially with the ability to encode business logic in a lot of ways. So yeah, we will be seeing that. I think, it'll emerge in different ways. It doesn't mean banking entirely disappears in its traditional sense, but maybe you start to have more emphasis on some of the roles that that we actually will really need institutions for. So things like this, the kind of liminal space between the physical reality and Web3. So how do you identify somebody in person? Do you do that at a bank or a post office where you go in and identify yourself, or do a number of things that help validate you, and then therefore you're sort of entered into this system with a sense of actual accuracy. It's not just fake data, et cetera. So you're going to see those kinds of roles be more important. It's also true of the growing kind of role of the Internet of Things. You'll start to see data from sensors and other kinds of machines, and that as a whole user base that really participates in Web3 as sort of a validation function. So some of it will just be a shift. And I think the businesses that are smart, even if they're legacy businesses, will be the ones that figure out what parts of what they do are still relevant in this future, and what parts should be automated or should be, become a smart contract or become some, layer 2 protocol of middleware. So we'll see, different parts get gutted, and the ones that are smart about it and sort of see the writing on the wall will be the ones that actually figure out, how do I reshape the parts of my business that still add value in a Web3 world.
Yeah, I think a lot of industries are getting smarter about that now, because when I think back of that transition from the early web where all of us were proponents of it, and we're like, yeah, the web, right? And a lot of industries were like, this will never work. And then suddenly, there was a big disruption and it really hurt their industry. I feel like now it seems like a lot of those industries are trying to get ahead. Like there are traditional companies that are very traditional in their approach to product that have now innovation groups within the company that are trying to think about how are they going to handle transitions in the future. And I would say 10 or 15 years ago, we didn't even see that happening. That investment wasn't even being made. It was more like business as usual, and we're just kind of moving along and we'll adapt as things adapt. But nowadays you have to be like 3 steps ahead because everything moves so quickly. And that kind of comes into this question I had about Bitcoin. Obviously, Bitcoin is very big right now. Everyone's talking about it. Like I was even at the bank a year ago, and the teller that was at the bank was telling me that they were getting calls like crazy from people saying, how do I buy Bitcoin? How do I buy Bitcoin? And it was like a frenzy. But I have this fundamental question. So there's this old kind of crude saying that says pioneers get slaughtered and settlers prosper. And I'm trying to figure out if Bitcoin is a pioneer or a settler. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think, we almost treat it as a different, as a reserve asset in this world. It's obviously still has its own volatility. I'm not trying to say it's totally stable, but
yeah,
it's not the network you're going to build these things on. If you look at sort of computation, Bitcoin is like the calculator, right? It is a computer, but it's a very specific one. It crunches numbers, and it can do a very specific set of functions and manage the state of a ledger, right? What we're talking about now are like MacBook Pros, essentially, which can manage the state of many applications at once, right?
Yeah.
So it's a fundamentally different thing. But Bitcoin is a long-standing project, and it has adoption that I think, it's not going away. And it definitely creates, an asset that people understand increasingly. And it's a finite asset, which is also, unique in this world today. So I think it's not going away. It's definitely going to continue to play a role in this space. It's just a slightly different role than, say, some of the network tokens that are really more about spending them in order to compute and use the computing power of a network to run an application.
Yeah, I was going to say, because like when I think about like Ethereum, it seems like it has such utility behind it, right? Like you mentioned NFTs earlier, right? And it's like, well, within the Ethereum network, people are creating these tokens and assigning them to digital assets. And it's like, to me, it feels like a big growing opportunity where with like Bitcoin, it's an asset, but most people are just kind of sitting on it, not sure what to do with it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it will back different kinds of projects, and it will be an asset, a continued asset in this space. It's just a slightly less dynamic asset than some of the other ones we're sort of looking at now of what it really does. But I think we're going to see a lot more pioneers in this space, and probably a lot more settlers. It'll be a really exciting place to watch and continue to see how Web3 develops. We're really just at the beginning, like I said. And I think probably for my fund, what we look at Warburg Serres Investments, we really fundamentally believe that Web3 is inevitable.
Yeah.
It's not that it's better. We try not to say normative language like, oh, it's going to be such a better world now that, we have Web3. It's just that it's inevitable. This technology is out of the box. It's not going away. And it's, and it enables really new experiences and new kinds of infrastructure. And so, what we're betting on is that future is where everything will happen, and that today's entrepreneurs are going to be driving, the generational iconic companies of Web3. And so it's a great time to be really, to be an entrepreneur in this space because you're early. Mm-hmm. It's a great time to be an investor in this space because you get to see a lot of the, where's the writing on the wall? Where's everything going?
Yeah. And I know we have to wrap up because I know you have a hard stop today, but I had just two last questions. One is, can you tell us a little bit about your book? Because I just started reading it, The Basics of Blockchain, but I wanted to make sure that all of our listeners have a chance to hear about it.
Sure. So we wrote this book. It's a bit out of date at this point. I'm actually working on a revision for it.
Okay.
But it's a fast moving pace of innovation, and so it is still really considered the only pedagogically sound textbook in this space. I don't know how that totally flies with maybe other people who've written textbooks, but we wrote it to be really modular and allow students and people who are just interested in getting into this space to kind of understand the history of where it comes from, how it's changing, some of the major sort of questions to think about. So it's really we tried to write it as this chapter by chapter kind of literacy or guide to thinking about how blockchain influences business and economics and technology.
Okay. And so would you say the audience then for your book is people both like ourselves who are like kind of getting deep into the technology and want to understand it, as well as people who just want to have a general understanding of blockchain?
Yeah, I think it serves both audiences as well. It's not going to be a place where you learn to code or you learn, the deep mechanics from a mathematical standpoint or a cryptography standpoint, but it's definitely a good spot to get your feet wet and say like, well, what is going on here? And based on that and based on your own interests, what's worth, researching further.
Awesome. Well, Bettina, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today and chat with us. We really appreciate it. And if any of our listeners want to get a hold of you, what is the best way to reach out to you?
Honestly, just on our website, either animalventures.com or warburgserres.com is the best way. I stay off the Web2 social media.
Okay.
I am on Twitter, be Warburg, but otherwise, yep, the traditional website works for now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for listening. And we will see you all next week.
Thanks a lot.